Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something pretty heavy, but honestly, absolutely crucial to understand. The mechanics behind mass violence and genocide. Look, I know it's a dark topic, but we can't just look away, right? Instead, we're going to look at this directly and methodically, breaking down exactly how these dark chapters of history are actually built, piece by piece.
So, first things first, is mass violence just sudden chaos? When we look back at history, it's really easy to assume atrocities are just these spontaneous eruptions of hatred, kind of like a volcano just suddenly blowing its top. But is that actually historically accurate? Is it really just a sudden collective loss of sanity? Or is there a hidden structure underneath the whole shebang?
To answer that, here's our roadmap for today. We'll look at the myth of chaos, creating the other, the echo chamber, the architecture of violence, and finally, prevention and historical literacy. All right, let's get into it.
Okay, part 1, the myth of chaos, and why this is actually a deeply mechanical process.
When you actually look at the historical data, it turns out genocide is a highly organized step-by-step machine. It is a process. Check out this pipeline of escalation. Step 1, identify a target group. Step 2, blame them for society's problems. Step 3, manufacture fear. Step 4, dehumanize them. And Step 5, justify violence against them. Do you see how much groundwork is laid down before any physical harm actually happens? The targeted group gets methodically isolated in the public's mind way before the first strike.
Moving on to part 2, creating the other. This is basically the setup. Think about it. Before you can justify harming a group, you have to separate them from the rest of society, usually using extreme nationalism. You literally have to fracture the community. On one side, you've got the quote-unquote real citizens, suddenly defined by this really narrow, strict ethnic or racial purity. And on the other side, outsiders, minorities who are deliberately framed as threats to national unity who just have to be removed. When belonging becomes exclusive, like we saw with Nazi Aryan nationalism or Serbian ethnic nationalism in Bosnia, these minorities immediately become vulnerable to this super dangerous us versus them rhetoric. The line in the sand is drawn.
And well, how is that line actually enforced? Through massive scapegoating. You'll hear things like, they are ruining the country, or they are taking jobs, or they threaten our safety, our culture, our religion. Leaders use this intense fear-mongering to convince ordinary, everyday citizens that a specific group poses an absolute existential threat to their very survival. It's wild.
Historically speaking, this scapegoating is shockingly consistent. In Germany, Jewish people were falsely blamed for severe economic problems. Over in the Ottoman Empire, Armenians were accused of betrayal. In Myanmar, the Rohingya were aggressively framed as societal threats. The really crucial takeaway here is that manufacturing fear makes ordinary, otherwise peaceful people entirely willing to accept extreme discriminatory policies. The fear just completely overrides their empathy.
All right, part 3, the echo chamber. This is where the major psychological shift happens.
So that manufactured fear we just talked about, it gets weaponized through intense propaganda and total dehumanization. The Nazis described Jewish people as vermin, while Hutu extremists in Rwanda called Tutsis cockroaches. Why use those specific awful words? Well, by portraying people as animals or diseases or parasites, authorities are basically psychologically hacking the public to normalize hatred. Once you train people to stop seeing others as fully human, violence against them becomes infinitely easier to justify. In their minds, they aren't harming a neighbor anymore, they're quote-unquote cleansing a problem.
And this psychological shift doesn't just happen by accident. It takes constant repetition of stereotypes, state-controlled media and education systems, rewriting history, and framing the violence as self-defense or somehow necessary. Genocide almost always requires massive, overwhelming persuasion before mass participation. The echo chamber has to be deafening. We're talking deliberate state tools here, like Nazi propaganda films or Rwandan radio broadcasts specifically encouraging killings.
Now for part 4, the architecture of violence, the actual execution phase.
Okay, once the psychological groundwork is laid and the population is primed, the actual physical machinery of destruction is activated. And mass violence requires this really frightening duality. On one hand, you have active systems of power, militias, police, and laws stripping rights away. Historically, this translates into concentration camps and organized deportations. But on the other hand, there's a passive requirement, bystander inaction and international silence. A painful example of this is the UN's failures during the Rwandan genocide. It requires both a system of power willing to organize the violence and a public or international community that is completely unwilling to stop it.
So the fundamental takeaway from the historical sources we've explored today is just this. Genocide is not chaos. It is highly organized and it is actively enabled. Mass violence doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It relies on a mechanical architecture of willing militias, unjust laws, and the deafening silence of the global community to actually function.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Prevention and Historical Literacy. The resolution. You might be wondering, why study something so incredibly grim? Well, because warning signs can appear in many societies without automatically leading to genocide. Our goal here is historical literacy and prevention. We aren't trying to label every single modern conflict or political dispute as genocide. Instead, by understanding exactly how this machine is built, from the early rhetoric all the way to the dehumanization, we empower ourselves to dismantle it before it ever gets fully operational.
And so, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Are we paying enough attention to the warning signs in our own media and rhetoric today? Seriously, think about this the next time you consume media, listen to political rhetoric, or jump into online discourse. Recognizing these 5 pillars early, seeing the scapegoating, spotting those us versus them setups, is absolutely our best defense against the unthinkable. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, for focusing in and doing the really hard work of learning from our past. Keep asking questions, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you next time.